resume.
Thank you very much. Good morning. For the record, my name is Don Rosenblum, appearing on behalf of Area D, Gilnet Area B, Sainer. Gentlemen, I have about 5 further questions to ask you during the time allotted for my cross-examination. The first one is to you, Mr. Nelson. I may have not caught this correctly in your testimony in chief yesterday morning, but I believe you said something to the effect, and we don't yet have a transcript, I should say, and so I'm not reading obviously from a transcript. I believe you said that reports about illegal activities by your staff were presented to resource managers who either didn't want to do anything about it or didn't know what to do about it. Is that the gist of some testimony you gave yesterday morning?
That's the gist of the examples that I provided yesterday, and it is a fairly frequent occurrence.
Can we learn more about that, those occurrences? Explain to us what exactly happens with your staff. I assume that they come across illegal activity, violations as they see it of the Fisheries Act. What then transpires?
Well, I guess with the information that I provided yesterday, a lot of our patrol time and effort is focused on close time. But in the cases or the examples that I provided yesterday, it was during open time, and our officers, in the course of doing their license checks, checking for validation of people on the water, they would count some of the fish that they see in the vessels and accumulate that information and then go to the resource manager with it.
And then what happens in many cases?
In cases where I've done it, and in the cases that I cited yesterday, the one in the Lower Fraser that I cited yesterday, the fishery officers took it to the resource manager in charge of estimating the catch, and the feedback was, well, you know, it could have been this, could have been that, but there was a discussion, and after that, the final word on it was, it's been raised and it'll be discussed at a next resource management conference call.
And then could I assume you never hear anything more about it?
No. Yeah, there was nothing further that I knew of happened in that case.
Can you explain to us from your perspective why these resource managers are not backing up your staff and pursuing matters that are raised by CNP?
Well, I can't explain it totally, but I do know that sometimes the information back is they have a defined model and have certain sampling procedures involved in it, but what we provide them is hard to extrapolate on and what that might mean in the entire overall catch. That's sort of the gist of the discussion back, but let's find a way to use it. Like let's as I stated yesterday, I think one solution might be to put a rigorous random sampling process into the catch monitoring system, where fishery officers go out and check a sample site that they can then inject into their formulas to account for some of this, what we view is under-reporting of catch.
The problems you just testified about are quite frequent?
In my experience, yes, and what's reported to me, yes.
Yes.
And not in all fisheries. Like, there's a tendency for everybody to under-report. I mean, that's if they're told they have a total allowable catch of X, well, if you report your numbers accurately and get there sooner, you're not going to catch as many fish and as the next guy to you who might be getting away with it.
You testified briefly yesterday about 2 programs that I would like to have you expand upon your evidence. One is the Charter Patrol program, and the other is the Marine Enforcement Officer program under the Coast Guard. Let's take the first of those programs. The Charter Patrol program, you testified yesterday that this program had been in existence but was terminated. Was that terminated around the year 2000?
I don't remember exactly, but I know the numbers were lower and lower and lower to the point, there was 37, I think is the number I quoted yesterday at one time is what we had on the coast. And I don't know the exact year where it became zero.
No, I'm told it was quite an effective program. Do you agree with that?
I think it was in two counts. Another set of eyes and ears for us dealing in compliance work, and certainly was vital for resource management and gathering better catch information.
Can you tell the Commissioner a little bit more about this program? How did it operate? Who were the parties on these patrol boats?
I didn't work much. I'll provide a little bit of perspective and maybe ask Scott to add something. He worked on the coast as well. But essentially they are vessels that are owned by private people, and in the 30 or 40 foot range generally, and there'll be perhaps one or two people on the boat, and they are hired under contract to the department for would pay them a daily rate, X number of dollars per day for 100 days. And during fishing season, these vessels will be out on the water in certain areas and provide a service to us of gathering catch information and basically observing, recording, reporting incidents that they might see back to CNP.
Were these boats licensed boats?
No, these were privately owned vessels for the most part. Now, Scott, do you have?
Yeah, that's correct. There were a combination of types of vessels where they would provide a service and then be allowed to fish as payment and provide us so that the fish that they would harvest after a period of time, we did this with herring fisheries and others, would then be used as the payment. But what Randy's described is correct as well. This program kind of metamorphosized, if you want to call it, over a period of time. The version that was quite effective to us was back in the middle to late 90s, as Randy described. A contract would go out, and a solicitation for a contract, and a vessel and a crew would be hired and paid a per diem per day. As example, I know some vessels were being paid up to about $100 or $1,800 a day, depending on the size, because they'd be quite large. And these vessels were primarily used for CNP enforcement purposes. And they'd be out, and exactly as Randy's described, our eyes and ears to augment. And that was done when what we call the Gray Fleet, which is our fishery patrol program that we had, and when I started in the 80s, was in excess of 35 vessels. We actually had a marine division within the department. And as that was cut back, we were concerned about on-water presence. And the last patrolman was, as I described, that eventually was cut. And we've now gone to the 4 Coast Guard vessels and our use of the day boat, the ribs. But it was a very effective program for us, given, again, as I described yesterday, 29,000 kilometers of coastline.
Now, the individuals that were manning these particular boats, they wouldn't have any law enforcement authority, would they?
In fact, some of them did. They were similar to the MEO program, where they had been trained. Some of our skippers and people had been trained, and they would be given limited powers. They could write tickets and so on. They weren't able to arrest and seize vessels and so on, but they were given limited powers. And they would report directly to the detachment in the area that they worked, and would work in conjunction with the CNP staff on water.
And those that didn't have law enforcement authority would presumably radio to your staff of their what that we were witnessing in terms of infraction. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, through the radio or direct communication. They'd also work in concert with the resource management, what we call charter patrolmen, whose primary duty was to collect catch information, hail information, and would work with the resource managers when, again, because of the lack of actual presence, patrol vessel presence, they would be on there during the times that the fisheries were occurring, collecting this information for in-season management.
So it sounds, gentlemen, as if you were getting a lot of bang for the buck. Why did it stop?
Like a lot of things, times change, funding change, costs go up, funding availability drops. The charters that Scott was talking about, where it was commercial vessels and they were paid with fish, court decision, the LaRock decision, stopped that from happening. So that was one thing that happened. The department has moved to individual transferable quotas in some areas, and so the derby style fisheries are somewhat less. There's less fishing time out there. There's a whole lot of combinations, but it's probably best to ask a resource manager the real reason why the numbers have dropped.
All right, but from your perspective, you would like to see that program re-implemented?
I would like to see us have some more marine presence, whether it be charters, or the next question you had was MEOs, or we got to have some presence in the marine environment. This is one tool that could work.
Related exclusively to the marine area, would not have related to the river?
I'm not sure on that. If there they would have been just in the lower river, but I'm not sure.
We actually had one vessel in this program based out of Steeston, and they in fact did a very similar type service. It was an older gentleman and his wife that were the two individuals, and he actually had, again, limited enforcement powers for a period of time. When that program ended, he then focused his activities under resource management, where he would use a small inflatable to collect catch information, but he was no longer involved in any type of compliance or enforcement.
Well, I may be naive, but why would this program have not applied to the river area, especially after the kind of evidence we heard about yesterday?
It was primarily related to the commercial fisheries.
I appreciate that, but I'm asking, again, very naively, why would this program not be also an effective tool in terms of monitoring in the river system?
I think it might be because in the river, it's a lot easier. Your fishery is much more concentrated, and our patrol capabilities of smaller vessels is much greater. Whereas the charter boats were more out in the ocean, where it's more open water. That's what I would think of.
Thank you for that. And I come now to the Coast Guard element and to the CCG Marine Enforcement Officer Program. Again, yesterday you testified that program is also defunct, is it not?
Yes.
And that program was operational until approximately what date? What year?
Started in the 90s with, maybe I can just give a little bit of a background on it. The Marine Enforcement Officer Program was training Coast Guard employees who were on the Coast Guard vessels in fisher officer work. They were trained, issued sidearms. They were fully trained and capable of doing enforcement work. There was 55 of those at the start of the program. Now, over the course of time, some of those Marine enforcement officers did a lot of compliance work for us. They were really keen on doing the enforcement work, ranging to the other extreme where some people didn't want to do this. They wanted to be work on the Coast Guard vessels and not do enforcement. So we had a whole range of willingness to assist us. But some of the staff were very effective at doing their job. But over the course of time, the training didn't keep up, and as crew graduated into captains, the captain couldn't leave the vessel. So the numbers over time reduced to the point where about 2 years ago, we were down. I think we're down to 11. And in the last year, it's been announced that they will not be doing. Coast Guard will not be doing any enforcement work, and they'll be phasing out the program.
You're disappointed with that?
Yes, because it's another presence on the water, a capability we had to do compliance work. And the 4 main patrol vessels that we have now are going to be replaced over the next several years with the midshore patrol vessels, which are a larger vessel. And we have been told we should expect to put fisher officers on those vessels. And as I said yesterday, that's going to take a lot of staff. Now, what I did do is, at a meeting with the former Director General of Coast Guard, I tabled the idea of, okay, you've said you're out of the marine enforcement program, but could we consider, with the new midshore patrol vessels, having 2 trained marine enforcement officers on board at all times? In other words, 2 of your crew on that boat have to be trained in fishery officer work. And we will put one uniformed fishery officer on board with them. That way, you can meet the standard of having to have 3 officers to do a patrol on the water, but you wouldn't have the need to put 3 uniformed fishery officers on board the vessel. 2 of the crew members could assist that officer whenever he's on board. And if the fishery officer is not on board, then the marine enforcement officers wouldn't have to do enforcement work. That way, it would meet their needs and still allow us to use the Coast Guard vessels without a full complement of 3 fishery officers.
Very briefly, his response?
That sounds like something we could consider, but that was quite some time ago, and nothing has happened since.
Fair enough. I have 10 minutes left, and I have
Okay.
2 topics that I do want to cover. Mr. Nelson, last occasion when you were here 2-3 weeks ago, you and I had an exchange over this business of the unpaid fines and the $1 million. And your counsel yesterday in chief clarified the testimony you gave previously. And I understand from yesterday's testimony that you are led to believe there are approximately 1,700 or 1,800 offenders that have not paid their fines. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, my question to you is this. Yesterday, you testified that you have been able to achieve some linkage between unpaid fines and license renewals. Did I not understand that?
Yes.
And can you tell me what is that linkage? What licenses are not renewable without the payment of fines?
It was commercial licenses that I was referring to.
All right. And only commercial licenses?
Yes, because
I'm sorry.
because the recreation are issued by the province.
Yes. Now, can you foresee, with the cooperation of the provincial government, that the structure we just spoke about in terms of the inability to renew a license could, with the cooperation of the province, prohibit the renewal of, for example, driver's licenses without the payment of fines?
That would be a wonderful thing.
Yes, and if that was arranged with the provincial government, one would see a huge turnaround in the payment of these fines, wouldn't they?
I would think so.
And would you, are you aware that in the Yukon Territory, albeit they do not have a provincial federal structure, that such an arrangement it does in fact exist in terms of the payment of fishery fines?
I'm not aware of that.
All right. Have you ever had discussions with the provincial government to encompass the provincial licensing system in terms of the payment of fines?
One of my staff has had some discussions, but I personally haven't, and I know some of the advice within the department is that would be really difficult to do, but I'm all for it. I would love to see us try and do it and push to do it, yes.
That would certainly add to the deterrence of committing violations on the water, wouldn't it?
Yes, in my view, yes.
Thank you. The last area that I want to speak about relates to the fiscal situation, and you have given a great deal of evidence both last day and yesterday in respect to the chronic shortfalls on funding. In the PPR, and I asked Mr. Lund if he would bring this up, at page 63 of the PPR, it basically documents the fiscal shortfalls that you are encountering within CNP, and for example, paragraph 131, 132. What I don't see here, and I'm not faulting the authors of this report, but I don't see information about the current fiscal year. I appreciate this report was dated April 19th of this year, which was just 19 days in the new fiscal year. I do not believe this commission up to this moment in time has the evidentiary base in respect to the fiscal issues for this current fiscal year, especially in the context of the Deputy Minister testifying late last year about the 5% cuts that she was facing from Treasury Board. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, yes, I can, and it's no wonder that they wouldn't have the information on April 19th, because we wouldn't either.
Do you have it now?
We have it now, and last week we had a meeting with the chiefs, and we went over all the numbers, and what we came up with in the end is we were short about 500 or 600,000 in salary, and about 400 or 500 in operating money by our projections. So we looked at it and said, okay, with the salary let's address the salary shortfall first, because you have to pay your employees. We looked at, we currently have 5 vacancies in the region. We said we can't fill those this year, and that will generate us part of the savings. That left us with about 260,000 short in salary. So then we looked at, well, how are we going to make this up? The only salary option we have is on overtime. We considered cutting that, and then we thought, no, let's do what you call risk manage. In other words, hope that this year is like most, in that some officers will retire and some may move to other jobs, and that $260,000 shortfall in salary will accumulate over the rest of the fiscal year. And I'm fairly confident that that will happen on the salary dollar side. On the operating side, we've asked our chiefs to go back and rework their numbers and produce a work plan with that reduction in operating money.
Right. Is this fiscal year even more challenging than last year's fiscal situation?
Definitely.
Significantly so.
Yes.
And then we are all staring down April 1st of 2012, and we've learned about the PIC fee monies being terminated. We learned about the Williams money being terminated. What's the prognosis for 2012 in light of what you're facing even now?
Much worse, and that's where we could be faced with the shortfalls equivalent of 30 plus fishery officers. So it'll be much more dramatic.
I thank you very much for answering my questions, both of you. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Philip Eidsvik for the ARE and the Fisheries Coalition. It's 10:30, and I originally had an hour, but I understand we're in some time pressure, so I'm going to try and finish before then. Mr. Nelson and Mr. Coltish, and perhaps Mr. Nelson, you could answer these questions. And we're often wondering about the importance of enforcement. And for most Canadians, the only interaction they're going to have with DFO is through a fishery officer. Is that correct?
In a lot of cases, yes.
Yeah. Unlikely they're going to meet a DFO scientist or a fishery manager or minister or deputy.
Not as frequently.
And most interactions with the public are pretty good?
Yes. Yes, very good. And we've made some concerted efforts at improving that. And I'd say over recent years, it's much improved.
Yeah. Some can be kind of difficult.
Some can be extremely difficult.
Sworn at, called names,
Worse.
attacked with weapons,
Yes.
shot at.
There's been shots fired over nearby fishery officers. Nobody's ever been hit.
Anybody ever take you aside and say, what a great job you guys have done, and complimented you?
Ken Melloway did, I understand, a little while ago. So it does happen.
It does happen. And the importance of enforcement, if there's a species in trouble, and you have a bunch of DFO scientists working and some fishery managers meeting, and there's papers and conferences, and after many years, typically, they decide we're going to stop fishing on that species. Is all that work worth anything at all if there's not an enforcement presence to stop the fishing?
It has some value. It has a very high risk of not being followed. So it's, I wouldn't say it's worthless, but it's, once people find out that there's not a presence out there, the small fraction of society that breaks the law will grow and grow and grow, in my view.
Do you think senior management gets how important the enforcement role is?
Some do.
Some do. And then it brings me to budgeting. We talked quite a bit about that. And I'm not going to bring you through all the documents because you've gone over it a few times. But I wouldn't mind if you mind, Mr. Lund, going to Exhibit 77 at page 60. And I'll read it while he's bringing it up. At the bottom of the page, it says, DFO must formulate a strategy and plan that will marshal the personnel, facilities, equipment, and communication systems needed to reestablish a credible enforcement deterrent. The first step in the process must be a proper assessment of what is required at a minimum to ensure adequate enforcement. This cannot be achieved in the context of a budget exercise. Once the essential elements of an effective enforcement system have been specified, then and only then can the authorities look to see if the available funding is sufficient. If at any time it is perceived that the existing budget cannot support adequate enforcement capacity, DFO should be prepared to reallocate priorities within the department. Has that been done?
Not in my experience.
The way Mr. Fraser stated it out, it's actually backwards. First you get a budget and then you're told this is how much you can enforce, whereas he said, tell us how much you need to enforce and we'll find the money for you.
I guess with the Fraser, there had been some information pulled together on what some of our needs were to do a credible program, as there were in 2005. And for a short time, I would say we were achieving some of those results, but it's the long-term permanent solution that has to be achieved. And these have tended to be temporary.
Now, you've had other people and other parties saying we need more money for enforcement, and that would include organizations such as the people that I'm here for today. The RE fishermen have been saying more money for enforcement. Mr. Coulters, I see you nodding your head.
Sorry, are you asking me if I've heard that?
Yeah, if you've heard from other groups that we should be supporting more enforcement in DFO.
I think through meetings, through the Integrated Salmon Fisheries Dialogue, the Integrated Harvesters Planning Committee, the feedback is from all user groups, generally, and the public, that they ask for more enforcement. Now, we can't be behind every tree and along every section of river, but I think there's a balance, and in my view, we're on the low end of the scale. Certainly not what public expects from us.
Mr. Lund, if I could go to Exhibit 605 at page 49, please.
Just in addition to that, Mr. Commissioner, during my service as area chief of the North Coast, which is the general duty uniform officers, as a result of the interactions I used to have with many of the organizations, the fleet, the industry, I would attend on behalf of the department many of the industry meetings, and there wasn't a one that I attended after in discussions with regards to our program that I wouldn't be approached by individual members expressing what could they do to assist us in obtaining additional funding for our program. And on many of them, motions would be passed with the idea of requesting from the department, from the minister, stabilize an additional funding for our group, for CNP.
What I brought up, the next exhibit, is a House of Commons report in 2004, and at the bottom, second to the bottom paragraph, it says,
I see that, it jumped out at me.
yeah, secondly, the committee proposes the government in Canada, and I like the last sentence, an amount of 25 to 30 million would be a good start. Now that was the Bloc Québécois, the Liberals, the NDP, and the Conservatives. So what I'm saying is your pleas for enforcement dollars have been made at the political level, they've been made at the stakeholder level, they've been made inside the system through you and your associate fishery officers, and yet we're still in trouble on enforcement. Do you feel like this is just a never-ending battle? It must be a bit demoralizing.
Yes, but I'm persistent.
Okay. If we could go to the PPR 13, page 125, please.
Mr. Commissioner, yesterday I exhibited what I could call a little bit of passion for when I was talking about the fact that, people love us and, we need some money and leave us alone. And when I say that, this line of questioning and is exactly that type is, and these recommendations is that for those of us in this business, that we've been here, a long time, we see these recommendations, these comments over and over from people well above our pay grade and our wisdom probably. And it is very frustrating for us when we face what we're facing as an example this year and next, understanding the expectations of the people of Canada that place upon us, that we see and meet and talk about every day in the communities, and are asked, what can we do to help you? So I think there's a huge amount of support for us, other than maybe in the exact locations or in places that we need it.
And I think I mentioned yesterday too, along that, I'm concerned about the fishery officers who are out there in the field every day and are feeling these constant questions like, why aren't you out there more and more? And have to continue to try do the job under extremely stressful situations. So it's tough.
Mr. Lund's been kind enough to bring up this graph, and I was curious when I was looking at it, what the heck is the NCR?
National Capital Region. So that's the Ottawa part of the department.
What type of fisheries do they have in the NCR?
Well, it's the senior management segments of all the departments. So it was put in there. It really isn't relative or relevant to the three East Coast marine areas, and Central and Arctic was put on there too because it is a region, but it's quite different than the marine ones.
I guess I'm wondering. There's no billion-dollar commercial fishery there. There's no Aboriginal fisheries. You don't need helicopter overflights, night patrols, and there's no 400,000 recreational fishermen. Yet we have in Ottawa a fairly big expenditure.
Let's keep in mind that this is a percentage of the ecosystems and fisheries management. So the numbers may not be
significant.
Yeah, it may not be as significant. I could check and find that out, but I'm not sure it was just to show the percentages within the programs.
I guess the next question I'm trying to figure out is, do you think the minister and some of the other bodies that do oversight, such as the Parliamentary and Senate Fisheries Committee, are accurately advised on a regular basis about enforcement issues? And the reason I ask that is our system of government is set up so that it's accountable through the minister, and those committees are set to be oversight. And I've always wondered whether the minister knows, and perhaps if we could go to Mr. Lund, Coalition documents at tab 9. And this is to do with the 1994 fishery, and we are going back a bit, but I think a little bit of history is appropriate. So if we look at the first quote in that cover page, it's Minister of Fisheries.
Sorry, Mr. Odsvik, if you don't mind me. Mr. Commissioner, this is a document that appears to be a collection. Oh, sorry, it's Tim Dixon for the record. It appears to be a collection of quotes put together by the Fisheries Survival Coalition. And I'm not sure of their source. As I say, it seems to be put together as an advocacy piece by the coalition, and I'm just not sure how helpful that is for you.
Do you remember the Minister of Fisheries stating that in '94, Mr. Nelson, or something like that?
I don't remember that quote. I honestly don't. I don't know if Scott does.
No, I couldn't say at all on this one, though.
Well, but perhaps we can move on. Following, in 1994, there was a number of leaks from papers and documents released by fishery officers. And that led to a fairly large public outcry and finally led to a meeting between fishery officers and the minister. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you attend that meeting?
I chaired it on behalf of the fishery officers.
Were you there also, Mr. Coltish?
Yes.
How many times did it help resolve? Did the minister finally get a grasp on the enforcement troubles you were facing?
Yes.
And how many times have you met with our various ministers since that time?
I've met the current minister once in Regina at a troop graduation, just briefly, but that's all that I remember since that.
And that's it since 1994. And it took a fairly big crisis to get the meeting in '94.
Yes.
If we could go to Exhibit 77, Mr. Lunn. At page XII. Well, while we're doing that, perhaps I can ask you, as the head of enforcement in Ottawa, does he have an enforcement background?
The current person in
Yes.
the chair, he has some background in Environment Canada, but I'm not sure if it was compliance related.
So not a fisheries officer worked up through the ranks?
No, definitely not.
At page XI, and if we go down partway through, and it's the second to last paragraph, the second sentence, and it says, well into the 1994 salmon season, when reports of abnormal numbers of missing sockeye were made public, some DFO officials were still in a state of denial as to the existence of a problem. And that was the reason I brought up Mr. Tobin's information. And do you believe the department was in a state of denial about enforcement in 1994?
Yes, and has been there occasionally since.
Yeah, given the instructions for cuts coming up, would you say that the department is still in a bit of a state of a denial about the level and the commitment you need for enforcement?
Well, I guess I also recognize that the overall, government has to be fiscally responsible. But in my view, the cuts to the core program that is the last that takes the last face of that is facing the public all the time, and trying to deal with the compliance issues, I think it's gone beyond what public expectations are, below what expectations are.
Now, you talked a bit about yesterday about the enforcement in the public commercial fishery. Is there a particular violation, serious violation problem you need fixed there? In the public commercial fishery?
In the public commercial fishery, I view all the commercial fisheries. There are, I'd maybe ask Scott in his experience on the coast, but there are, I do have some compliance numbers. If Scott can answer a question, I'll see. I think I wrote something down about some compliance numbers here, but I have to check.
Okay.
I would suggest that the single biggest, two issues. One is license conditions and their enforceability, and DFO presence on the water are primarily the two issues. We generally have a good compliance rates with our commercial fisheries, other than when we get into things such as selective fisheries on weak stock, release of prohibited species by certain gear groups can be a problem. And again, at the end of the day, when it boils down to compliance, we find that in most cases, compliance isn't at an acceptable rate when we're present, when there's a DFO presence.
I did find the numbers I was thinking about, and this is from South Coast, which is Johnson Straits, Vancouver Island area, and in the comments were South Coast troll fishery, and this is from 2010, was the trollers were basically very compliant, except where dual fishing was involved, and in the net fishery there was about a 10% non-compliance issue. In the recreational fishery, there was a 7% non-compliance issue with problems arising in Port Alberni and Gold River. So that was some statistical information.
That helps me a little bit.
Yeah.
The 10% that you talked about in the commercial sector, what particular type of offense is that?
I don't know that.
Not offhand,
yeah.
Okay. And in the recreational fishery, is there a particular problem in there that needs to be fixed? I see you nodding your head, Mr. Poltish.
Well, again, experience. What we found with the general, I would say, compliance, or in the general public in many cases, is that people who are traveling from long distances, and I'll speak to my experience in the North Coast primarily, but as well as other parts of the province I've worked in. When people are traveling long distances, spending a lot of money, they want to go home with something. And we're finding more and more that people simply will get enticed to do whatever it takes. Now this isn't everybody. I mean, this is, when I say the creep, that is the compliance, non-compliance creep from those people who are generally very good people. The ones that are the offenders, the ones that are influencing, that they can see it and hear it and so on, are starting to creep into that generally good compliance people. And this is in every fishery. There's no question about it.
Okay. Thank you for that. Now I'm going to turn to the enforcement in the Aboriginal fishery. Mr. Nelson, 1986, you were a pretty young officer, I think. Probably didn't have any gray hair then?
No, that's right.
What year did you join the department as a fishery officer?
1977, January.
Okay. Were you surprised at the level of confrontation in some areas between Aboriginal fishermen and the department?
Very much so.
Was there an awareness inside the department at the time that the illegal sale of food fish was growing and quite widespread?
What I remember from back then, there were problems in the illegal sales of FSC. I couldn't say I could remember back if it was growing the same or where it was in relation to that time period.
Mr. Lund, perhaps we could pull up tab 7, please.
I was around in the 82 Pierce Commission report, and some of the findings in there seem to indicate that.
Okay. Are you familiar with this document, Mr. Nelson?
Sorry, Mr. Adswick. Mr. Commissioner, I object to this. Sorry, it's Tim Dixon for the record. I object to this document being put forward to these witnesses. It appears to be a transcript. It purports to be a transcript of some sort of meeting at which neither of these two officers is listed. It's not indicated on the document in any way how this alleged transcript was taken. It's utterly hearsay in respect of these officers and totally inappropriate in my respectful submission.
I don't think, Mr. McGowan, perhaps I could respond a little bit. And I know I'm going to get a fair amount of objections on this next section, but if my time keeps being...
I just stop you, Mr. Archibald,
Yeah.
for a second. Usually it's my practice to wait till I've heard the question to object, and maybe the appropriate thing would be for Mr. Eidvik to state the question he seeks to put to the witness. Perhaps if there's sensitivity around individual names, perhaps not naming any names, but explain to the Commissioner the question you intend to ask, and perhaps parties can weigh in after they know where you're heading.
I think before we do that, Mr. Nelson, were you familiar with this sting operation?
I'm familiar with some of the names in
Mr. Nelson, I'm sorry, I'm just going to
yeah.
stop you. There's been an objection, and I think that we have to resolve that before you go any further, Mr. Eidvik. So perhaps if you could state what your question's going to be, and we can hear from Mr. Dixon and anybody else who wishes to speak to it.
There's a number of questions that arise out of this document. It's one of the early looks, and it goes back to 1989, that goes to the scale and the practice and the ability to move large quantities of food fish. Perhaps if my friends are willing to concede that the illegal sale of food fish has been a tremendous problem that took tremendous DFO resources from about 1989 on, I'm quite happy to set aside the document.
Mr. Commissioner, I don't take my friend's suggestion there, and I do maintain my objection to this document. As I say, it's hearsay. I doubt very much that my friend's going to be able to establish in a meaningful way the basis for this transcript. But I do say this as well, that it's not appropriate in the context of this inquiry. And I refer, of course, to the finger-pointing sort of limitation on the questions that you wrote into your ruling on the interpretation of the terms of reference. And I just submit that this is getting a little off course from where this inquiry ought to be.
Mr. Eidvik, I think you are going to run into these difficulties. What we're dealing with here is process and the responsibilities that these officers carry out on their daily duties, and within the department, how they deal with specific areas that they might be concerned about or that they're charged with the responsibility for pursuing. So questions to them about process And if it includes illegal sales, for example, a matter that arose yesterday, then I would suggest to you that that would be an appropriate area to ask them about. But going back into these documents do not assist me a great deal. So if you want to deal with the process side and the area of responsibility, for example, if they have any statistics about how a certain area that you're concerned about has grown over the period of 10 years or 20 years, they can advise the Commission about how that element of their work has grown or diminished. I think that's fair. But to go into documents that are hearsay, that go back 20 or 25 years, I don't think are much help to me.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Are you aware that in the Lower Fraser, going back at least 2 decades, the illegal sale of food fish has been a tremendous problem for the department?
Yes, it has. And I, from talking with staff in the area, the level of sophistication has increased, and some of the techniques used has increased as well.
Well, I'll ask you the next question. Perhaps, Mr. Lund, you could pull up Exhibit 729 at page 18. Has there been a number of times where fishery officers were instructed not to lay charges or not to enter into a certain area where enforcement actions were compromised by fishery managers?
Sorry, the last part of the question was?
Where enforcement action was compromised by fishery managers.
It has happened, yes.
On this particular document at page 18 in the middle column, there's the first bullet. Fishery officers had been not instructed not to lay charges while delicate negotiations about fishing agreements were ongoing. Was a source of controversy at the time, I understand?
And I'm not sure, where is this from again?
This is the 1992 Peter Pierce report into the missing fish in 1992.
Yeah, I don't know where specifically they're referring to in that statement.
I think it's a general conclusion that he was making.
It's certainly possible, and somebody provided that information to him. I don't remember who it was or what it was in relation to. I don't know if Scott has any idea.
Not in reference particularly to this document, but I'm aware of a circumstance in the last several years where this has occurred.
If I could go to tab 9, Mr. Lund, at page 19. Tab 9 in our set of documents, page 19. Now, this is a meeting record, as the title states. Do you recognize?
I'm sorry, Mr. Eidswick. Anya Brown for the First Nations Coalition. Mr. Commissioner, I believe Mr. Dixon's objection with respect to tab 9 still stands, and I simply say that the coalition also has concerns about this entire tab. There are a number of documents, excerpts of documents. We question the relevance of them and also the timing of them.
I think I'll establish the relevance as I go along, Mr. Commissioner. This problem with no charges orders is a long-standing problem, and perhaps I can put that question again, but I don't think it will go properly without the evidence and the documents.
Well, I'm not sure that you want to establish relevance as you go along. Perhaps you could tell me what is the relevance of this document or these line of documents to this hearing.
In 1992, there was it was very controversial about whether the fishery officers had issued no charge orders. The department said that hadn't happened. Then we saw the same thing mentioned again in 2004, and we've heard the same instructions. I'm trying to establish, is this a bigger problem inside the department? Is there the will to enforce certain fisheries? Is it even across fisheries?
Why don't you just ask the question?
I think the documents provide context for the question, Mr. Commissioner.
I think you can ask these officers if they have any knowledge about the history of the matter you're relating to now, and then ask them the question you want to ask them.
Perhaps I can go to Exhibit 605, Mr. Commissioner. At page 77. Now if we go back to 1992, sorry, we'll start at the top, the first quotation. This is the Minister of Fisheries speaking in 1993. He says, with respect to the sale of fish, we are not doing this. And he's referring to the in-river Aboriginal commercial fishery. We're not doing this because we have to do this because of sparrow. We're doing this because we think it's the best public policy, because we know that for years the Aboriginals have been taking the fish and selling the fish in great quantities. It's an experiment to see this is a better way to do it. So here we have a Minister of Fisheries summing up the point that I've been bringing to you so far. The level and scale of illegal sales was such that they decided to try legalizing as a means to control and get a handle on it. Do I have that correct, Mr. Nelson?
With respect, Mr. Commissioner, I'm not sure this is the time to be reading documents and making submissions. If Mr. Eisvik has a question to put to the witness, a proposition he wants the witness to either adopt or speak to or expand upon, I don't object to that line of questioning, but simply pulling up documents and reading documents and suggesting to the Commission that they support a point and then moving on, I submit is not particularly helpful.
Based on your experience, did Minister Crosby have it correct, Mr. Nelson?
Well, what I believe what was being referred to here is the initial pilot sales that were started on the Fraser River. And in the first couple of years, the pilot sales had mandatory landings with them. And from what I recall in talking, although I didn't work in the area where this happened, talking to officers that did, the catch information during those initial pilot sales compelled First Nations to bring all their catch and have it recorded, and thought that information was actually fairly accurate. What happened after that was agreements were not reached, and later on economic opportunity sales were commenced.
And I'm going to go back to the question that I wanted to put to you. Have you ever heard of, in addition to the no charges orders, where charges have been laid and subsequently dropped due to interference, political interference by a minister or by a fishery manager or somebody else in the Aboriginal fishery?
I know of cases where charges have had to be dropped for a whole number of reasons. Sometimes it's because the resource manager had opened a fishery with the belief they had proper conservation, opened or closed a fishery believing they had proper conservation, and subsequently deemed they weren't able to. And so that happened a lot. And it used to happen a lot more as you go back in history. But since line reporting, it's happened less because we're able to speak out and be heard a little more about some of the problems we have with the regulations. As far as direction to officers to not charge or not patrol, there's a whole lot of factors that come into weigh there. And in some cases, very rarely, if there are some sensitive negotiations going on, we will keep that in mind. We're not saying to our officers, don't go out there, but be aware, things are a little tender out there. Let's approach this and work with them. And if another issue that can pop up is if there's a safety concern. And I actually did on one occasion, only on one specific location for a day or two, I can't remember exactly when it was, but I directed that we just not go and do any enforcement in that area because of just the anxiety and the risk of a confrontation.
Okay. Perhaps, Mr. Lundijk, if you could bring up Exhibit 606, page 35. Have you ever, Mr. Nelson, is there much audits going on the mandatory landing program? We understand, and the evidence is that the fish generally gets counted pretty well. The key to that program is attendance at those mandatory landing programs. Has there been any audits done of that? how many people are actually attending the MLP sites?
I don't know of any audit that's been done on it. I don't know if Scott has any answer.
I'm not aware of anything recently, but when the pilot sales programs were implemented, in particular on the Fraser River, CMP staff actually were tasked at that time to, if you want to say, do an audit, and that is the number of fishermen that were actually seen during patrol time versus the number of fishermen who actually landed, as well as at that time the First Nations Stalo implemented an Aboriginal Fishery Guardian program, which was very comprehensive, that DFO and CNP was involved in with training and so on, and worked quite closely with them. They too would assist and do a great deal of work on that, and we were very confident in the numbers and the compliance at that time. That's no longer in effect.
At the 2004 report by Brian Williams, the former Chief Justice, BC, and in the third paragraph down in the last sentence, and I want to ask you about this particular thing. It says it seems perverse the policy decision not to enforce laws against illegal sales undoubtedly encouraged both clandestine harvest and inflation of the legal FSC catch by those who wish to profit from the sale of some of their Section 35 fish. Mr. Williams calls it perverse, but wouldn't that be a natural outcome of a instruction not to lay charges, that people would continue to break the law?
It certainly would increase the risk of them doing it, yes.
If I could go to PPR 13 at page 55, Mr. Lunn.
Mr. Commissioner, could I just add, in the Lower Fraser, when I commented about the Aboriginal Guardian program, it wasn't just the Stalo that implemented the Musqueam band. Also implemented a process that was very comprehensive as well.
At page 55, and the issue that I want to get there is in the first paragraph, paragraph 106, and it's the question of illegal sales activity being especially difficult. Can you tell me why it's so difficult to deal with illegal sales of food fish?
Well, I'll give a little bit and then I'll ask Scott to follow up, but the difference between illegal fish and illegally caught fish is indistinguishable by looking at them. That's one of the most important things. So to prove a legal sale, you must prove where it came from, and that can be difficult. Just because somebody has a bunch of fish in their truck and they're driving along the Fraser River, you can't assume that those fish are from the Fraser River. You have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt where they came from. That's one of the biggest difficulties in doing illegal sales work, is determining exactly where they came from. When they were caught is another issue, and who caught them, and all those factors. But Scott, perhaps?
Yeah, the issue that we're facing today, as Randy described, is very complex. When General Patrol officers are out, the idea or the opportunity of seeing cash changing hands is very, very limited. As well, because of the legislation that's in place that prevents us from breaking the law, other than through authority under Bill C-24, Section 25 of the Criminal Code. We must be authorized to engage in activities. An officer must be designated by the minister, and we do have such people, but only those can actually engage in the type of covert activity where a sale is made to that person. But when it comes to the complex sales, and that is large volumes, we're dealing with companies, businesses, where a product may be delivered and the actual sale, transfer of cash or funds is made in many different ways, electronically, through bank transfers, through ways of storage versus fish and so on. So it becomes very complex, and that's exactly the reason why we need to mature into an organization that has the ability to track and forensically audit and go after those types of processes.
Perhaps I could move to page 58.
I just add one point too on the difficulties in illegal sales is most people like fish, and if they can get a good deal, they'll do it. For every person selling fish, there's probably a 50 or 100 buying, And it's, as described with Scott, to catch the actual transaction in hand is extremely difficult.
Yeah. I want to ask about Project Ice Storm for a minute here on at paragraph 119. And so Consulting and Audit reviewed your audit of those plants and came pretty close to 2 million pounds of FSC sockeye. And this is October when you did the audit. So I want to ask some questions around that. So this audit would not include fish that went across the border, food fish that went across the border. You wouldn't have caught it in a cold storage plant in Canada.
I'd have to ask Scott to answer that. I don't believe so, but it's suspected to be FSC. I don't think it was. We could validate every piece of that.
What we was seeing here is fish that was encountered in facilities in the Lower Mainland. There is at times, and has been through other projects, the realization of substantial amounts of FSC harvested in the Fraser River, particularly in the area from Hope downstream, that is transported or has been transported across into the U.S.
Okay, and the number of fish in cold storage would not include fish that was sent to Alberta or other provinces?
Not prior to counting, no.
Right, not prior to counting.
It wouldn't include any fish outside of what was in the cold storage.
Right.
Yeah.
No fish that was shipped overseas?
If it was, no.
Yeah.
No.
No fish that was sold illegally door to door?
No.
Well, again, we can't speak to what was done with this fish subsequent to being counted, but this figure represents the fish that we discovered or encountered in the facilities during the investigation.
I'm just trying to determine what quantity of fish would be in the facilities versus the quantity of fish that was used or could have not been caught under an FSC license, but not on the facility at October 15th. And so obviously fish that was removed prior to the date of the audit would not be included in the audit.
Correct.
That's correct.
Any fish stored in home freezers that was caught under an FSC license, obviously not caught in that audit.
That's correct.
Any fish that are canned at home, obviously not caught in that audit.
Correct.
Now what's the weight of an average Fraser sockeye?
5 or 6 pounds.
Yeah, 5.5 pounds, fairly good guess. Yeah. Now, when they were in the cold storage facilities, were all the fish processed at least to the point where they were headed and gutted?
I'd have to.
Yes. Yeah. There was, from what I understand, speaking to the people involved, by far the majority of fish, and I wasn't personally there, was processed, and in some cases to a point where it was packaged in small packages,
Much more than that.
smoked, and so on.
Well, I'm going to stay at the fairly simple point. If you head and gut a sockeye, it's roughly about a 25% body weight decrease.
That's correct.
So that brings our average weight of a sockeye in cold storage to about 4.25 pounds if we take and if you take the 2 million in storage and divide it by 4.25, that's 470,000 sockeye in cold storage in October.
Yes, that's correct. It's
And
pretty close to it. Yeah.
if they were filleted and stored in little packages, it would probably represent a larger number of fish. And what are the costs of processing and keeping fish in cold storage? Do you know what the cost per pound of heading and gutting is?
Well, it varies. There's a process or a term called, I'm just trying to remember it now, is dock tally or something such as that, and it's a percentage applied to the amount of product that the person has in. There's various ways of doing it, but generally it's either a price per the amount in the facility, a percentage. I wouldn't be able to be very specific with that.
But there's additional costs for heading and glazing,
Oh, yes.
filleting, glazing and freezing subsequent to processing, smoking, vacuum packaging has its own costs, and there's monthly storage fees. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And they can be substantial.
Depending on the amount and how long you keep it and what you've done to it, yes.
Now, so we have $2 million worth of processed sockeye in cold storage plants in October. What do you think the market value of that is roughly?
So, sorry, 2 million pounds.
2 million pounds, that's
Yes.
correct. What do you think the market value of headed, gutted, and I know it's tough, let's just assume it's all headed, gutted, rather than processed?
Well, it shouldn't be a market value if it's FSC, but commercially, many times the amount that would be there as far as cost. I mean, a commercial sockeye, I'm going to say I'm going to be speculating simply because of what I've seen it. We didn't do an analysis on the actual cost of what it would be worth, but 2 million pounds of sockeye, if it were, depending on the type and how it was done, to be commercially sold would be very valuable, very valuable.
And what happened to the fish that was in those plants?
A further review that was done in 2006, late spring, early summer, showed that about 60 to 70% of that product had been moved. It was no longer in the facilities.
Perhaps, and I want to talk about catch monitoring for a minute, and then I have one more issue and I'll be done. Yesterday you gave us some examples of differences between hails and reported catches. I wonder if we could go to tab 62, Mr. Lund. And while we're bringing that up, perhaps I can ask questions. When fishery officers are hired, do they have to sign certain forms and declarations concerning conflicts of interests and interests in commercial fishing?
Yes.
And what would those declarations require? For example, are you allowed to have a commercial fishing boat and be a fishery officer?
No.
Are you allowed to own a processing plant and be a fishery officer?
There's conflict of interest guidelines. I know it's specific on commercial licenses. I don't know if Scott has any idea if you had shares or something in a plant, you'd probably have to declare that. I don't know if that...
You have to disclose, and you cannot derive a direct income from anything that would be attributed to that would be deemed to be a conflict, in this case, a commercial or recreational type industries and so on.
Okay. I wonder if it would be appropriate, Mr. Commissioner, if those documents, declarations could be filed or brought to the Commission.
I apologize, Mr. Isaac. Which declarations are you speaking?
The declarations that the fishery officers sign concerning the conflict of interest provisions.
Our oath when we go through our training, I guess, is...
Also, under that would be through our ethics and values group out of DFO, there is a declaration that we sign that we need to disclose any conflict of interests. That would be what I think you'd be looking for.
Yeah, I think those documents would assist the Commission if that's possible.
I just, perhaps I can leave it with Commission Counsel to determine if there is a sample document along the lines that you're speaking of that could be filed.
Not your specific document, sample document. That's correct, Mr. Commissioner.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, we'll follow up and review the document. I'm not sure I'm persuaded at this point that it has any relevance to your mandate, but we'll certainly receive any document Mr. Eidsvik produces or Canada produces and review it for that purpose.
We're at the break, and I have one more issue to cover, Mr. Commissioner. Would you like to take the break?
How much longer will you be, Mr.
I think probably 5 minutes. Tab 62 is an audit of the Area 1 native catch sent from Bird Eye Onsen. Have you seen this document or heard about this particular audit? This is a DFO document.
Yeah, I'd have to have a quick look at it here. I may have scanned through it in the binders, but it doesn't ring a bell with me.
Well, do you know Herb Redekop?
Yes.
Credible fishery officer?
Yes.
Long-time fishery officer in the Fraser River?
Yes.
Well, I think the audit is interesting. He is the first email at the bottom of the page.
Sorry, Mr. Eidsvik, it's Tim Dixon again. It seems that Mr. Eidsvik's embarking on a question that will seek to have Mr. Redekop's comments in this email put into evidence. Mr. Nelson has just indicated, I believe, that that he's not familiar with the document. He's certainly not an addressee on it. I note as well that in the first paragraph, it's speaking of the Chinook salmon fishery, and that's an issue, one of the few issues you're not asked to address in this inquiry, and I suggest that this document is not helpful.
I think the catch reporting and accuracy of the catch reporting systems is the entire key focus of this inquiry.
Mr. Commissioner, part of the problem is the witness is being asked about a document that they're not familiar with. While it's true that Mr. Eidsvik provided notice of the documents that he intended to use during cross-examination, that list contained 70 documents, many of which were hundreds of pages long. The Commission requested that Mr. Eidsvik identify for the witnesses the specific documents and portions of them he might be taking the witnesses to so that the review of them could be reasonably accomplished, and that didn't happen. So I'm not sure how much assistance it is to you for Mr. Eidsvik to ask the witness about a project they're not familiar with or a document they haven't had an opportunity to review.
So far, he's just put the document to the witness. I haven't heard his question, so if he could ask the question, then I'd have some sense of what the relevance is.
In this particular document, there's a review of catches in an Aboriginal fishery in the Lower Fraser River. And Mr. Reddecock concludes that for every fish reported, there's 3 fish not being reported. Have you had experience or had that type of knowledge and heard of those kinds of things?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, this is an interesting document, though it's 1999, a fairly serious audit. Did you hear anything about it? Did it float through the system? Did you ever hear whether any change was made in the policy? I mean,
I don't remember. If it would help the Commissioner, Mr. Reddecock is here. I don't know if it's relevant. I can't say, thinking back to '99, that I recall an audit. There's been so many things on these topics over the years that I can't place this one on.
This is the kind of audit, though, that catch reporting in your group you could do as fishery officers.
Absolutely.
And the reliance on Hales that Mr.
Sorry, I say absolutely. If we were funded to do them, yes.
Okay. I want to go for a minute to and close here on recommendations.
Can I just make a comment, just for clarity's sake, sir? Understanding that in some of the economic fisheries that are now present, that First Nations participate in, where there are more stringent guidelines, landing stations and others, the catch reporting, in fact, is much better than what I would suggest still remains in the Aboriginal or in the FSC fishery. So there has been moves, significant moves through the PICFI process, in fact, where catch reporting in these fisheries, in these economic fisheries and others, are much better than what we see in the FSC fishery.
Yeah, this document relates to an FSC fishery. FSC fisheries are, most days of fishing on the Fraser River are FSC fisheries, aren't they?
Yes, that's correct.
I want to go to recommendations for a minute and close with that. There's been numerous studies, and you've heard the same recommendations from Pierce about enforcement, same recommendations from the Standing Committee, and again from Williams. And I know that one of the recommendations in Fraser, he said effective enforcement. Mr. Nelson, would effective enforcement look differently to you than perhaps an accountant in Ottawa?
I would imagine so. I mean, unless an accountant took the time to have discussions with some fisher officers and CNP staff, I don't know how they could unless they had some background in it.
How do you measure effective enforcement?
It's very difficult to measure because you don't know what you're not finding.
So in some ways that's a bit of a meaningless recommendation.
I think when I testified yesterday on the 2005 Williams, we are confident that the funding that we received is providing us an effective program. And as I stated, there could be 100,000 fish disappearing, but certainly not millions in the funding we've had specifically on the Fraser River to patrol the close time and get a handle on.
I'm getting to the point. Would it be helpful for the Commissioner to recommend that you set a specific number of fisheries officers? We need 250 fishery officers, and we need X amount of funding for O&M every year. And that way that could be measured. Would that be helpful for you? Mr. Coulter, I see you nodding your head.
It would take some time to put together, but yeah.
What I'm saying is, if you're going to do something, you need to be able to measure it. And the Parliamentary Standing Committee and the Senate Committee needs to be able to measure the recommendations coming out of this commission. Now we can go back to illegal sales of food fish. I'm not going to bring you to it because of time, but at Exhibit 77 at page 59, the Fraser report concluded that the repeal of the regulation concerning non-native possession of food fish caused serious enforcement problems. Would you agree with that?
At the time, it was the laws were changed. Prior to that, you could not be in possession of food fish unless you were First Nation. So obviously, it made it much more complicated to try and prove.
Do you know why that regulation was changed, repealed?
I believe it was for constitutional reasons, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, there was a challenge on the and it was deemed to be unconstitutional.
Okay. And I think I've asked you before, when you go down to a dock and there's a tote of commercial fish, public, legally caught, and a tote of FSC fish, and you pick a fish out of either one, you can't tell the difference, can you?
Nope.
Now, prior to about 1984, there was a regulation required the marking of Aboriginal food fish by cutting the snout and the dorsal fin off. If that regulation was still in place, you could pick that fish out and right away tell it's a food fish. Is that correct?
Yeah, you could, but it would give you a much greater degree of likelihood. I mean, it would seem that a commercial fisherman could cut them. You'd still have to prove where it came from. But it was a tool that was very valuable for us at the time.
If you went down to a commercial processing plant and there was a tote full of food fish that were marked versus the tote stored in by John Smith commercial fishermen, you could tell the difference. And right now you can't. Is that correct?
That's correct. Marking fish product in any means would benefit. I don't know if that's a possibility.
Now, if there was a regulation like that and a truck operated by a person who had food fish on board, caught under a food fish license, didn't have the snout and dorsal fin cut off, charges could be laid for that, and were in the past.
They were in the past, yes.
So you didn't actually have to trace the food fish and see the actual moment of sale, because you could prosecute non-native possession, you could prosecute somebody who had caught it under a food fish license but hadn't marked it as food fish.
It would be possible. I mean, laws have changed a lot over time. There used to be a law that said you couldn't transport Aboriginal caught fish below the mission boundary, like into the non-tidal area. So you would just simply have vehicles crossing the line. But all that's long ago, and I don't
Setting
think
aside constitutional issues, whether they're valid or not. And I think it's important to do that, because we obviously have a fishery that's, the evidence shows, is fairly out of control, and we need a means to get it under control. Would those tools be of assistance?
I think there are more modern tools that would be, or more modern ways of doing it. Cutting the nose and dorsal fin off was quite a infringement, if you will, on First Nations. It was one of the challenges. There could be a way to mark, as we talked yesterday. Perhaps in cold storage plants, there has to be some means of more accurately tracking all fish in their plants, and very strict, stringent guidelines around that.
And if somebody put food fish in a can in a commercial processing plant, if it had stamped on the can, along with the numbers that processing plants put on, this is Aboriginal food fish, illegal sale, or sale is illegal, you could always determine whether the can was food fish or commercial fish.
I think they do that with some recreational caught fish. It's if it's canned, they'll it'll be right on part of the tin. They'll say not for sale. So that means is there for canning.
The commercial halibut fishery that occurs on the west coast here has a tagging program that all halibut must be tagged when it's caught, when it's transported, processed, and so on. The constitutional solution may be that all commercial fish must be marked, tagged in some way of being able then, rather than Aboriginal fish, which has been, those provisions have been dropped.
Suffice to say, if you had the will, the budget, and the regulatory tools, you could enforce this fishery properly.
We could enforce all fisheries properly.
More effectively, anyway.
Thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you.
Perhaps time for a short break.
We'll now recess for 15 minutes.